Forget castles, knights, and fancy medieval feasts. The Middle Ages were a culinary survival horror. People didn't just eat weird food, they proudly served things that looked like dares, accidents, or straight-up mistakes. In this video, you'll see 44 of the weirdest, dumbest, and most revolting foods people actually ate in the Middle Ages. Not myths, not jokes. Real meals that explain why everyone needed so much mustard just to stay sane. 1. Cock ale. This was the original protein shake for bros who thought regular beer was just too boring. Brewers decided that ale was missing something important, and that something was apparently poultry essence. They would take a whole-cooked rooster, mash it into a paste with some spices, and throw it into a barrel of ale to ferment until the booze tasted like chicken soup gone wrong. They actually thought this meat soda would make them strong and healthy, which is just hilarious science. Imagine walking into a bar today and asking the bartender for a cold pint of chicken juice so you can get your gains while you get drunk. It sounds less like a beverage and more like a dare you would do at a frat party. 2. Syllabub. If you think milk and alcohol do not mix, then you would have hated this medieval party trick. To make a proper syllabub, the cook would take a bowl of cider or ale and literally milk a cow directly into the alcohol from the udder. The idea was that the warm spray of milk would create a frothy foam on top, while the acid in the booze curdled the cream into a weird, lumpy sludge. It is basically a curdled milkshake that gets you drunk. Imagine watching a bartender drag a live cow into the pub just to squirt warm milk into your beer, and acting like that is the height of sophistication. 3. Medieval blancmange. Today we think of blancmange as a boring vanilla dessert, but the medieval version was a legitimate culinary crime. Cooks would take cooked chicken breasts, mash them into a paste, and mix it with almond milk, sugar, and rose water. Yes, you heard that right, they made a sugary chicken smoothie and served it as a fancy sweet treat. It is basically poultry pudding. Imagine finishing your dinner and waiting for a nice dessert, only to be served a bowl of sweet floral chicken sludge. It sounds like something a toddler would invent by accident, but kings were eating this stuff on purpose and calling it fine dining. 4. Beaver tails. Beaver tails were the result of the most ridiculous dieting cheat code in history. The church said people could not eat meat on holy days, so everyone was desperate for a loophole to get a steak dinner. They looked at the beaver swimming in the river and decided that since it had a scaly tail, it must technically be a fish. This allowed monks and nobles to roast beaver tails and eat them while pretending to be super religious. The joke was on them, though, because the tail is basically just hard fat and gristle that tastes like oily candle wax, so they were chewing on gross rubber just to trick the rules. 5. Compost. You might think I'm making this up, but there was an actual popular dish in the Middle Ages literally called compost. It was a cold mixture of root vegetables like turnips and parsnips that were boiled and then drowned in a thick sauce of honey, vinegar, and spices. It looked exactly like the brown pile of rotting wet leaves you would find in your garden. Imagine inviting guests over for dinner and proudly announcing that the main course is a big steaming bowl of compost. It is the most honest name for a dish in history because it looked like trash and probably tasted like it too. 6. Lampreys. Lampreys are proof that people in the past had absolutely zero standards for what counts as seafood. These are ancient river fish that look like slimy rubber tubes with no jaw and a weird suction cup for a mouth. Despite looking like terrifying alien worms, medieval royalty considered them a massive luxury and paid top dollar to have them at feasts. King Henry I of England loved these ugly things so much that he famously ate way too many at one meal, which doctors later blamed for his fatal illness. It takes a special kind of appetite to look at a slimy, toothy wiggle worm and think, yes, that belongs in my belly. 7. Jellied eels. This dish is exactly what happens when you hate food and want to punish your own mouth. Cooks would chop up eels and boil them until the fish slime and natural collagen turned into a thick, clear gelatin that trapped the gray meat chunks inside like a biological brick. The worst part is that they serve this wobbly nightmare cold, so you had to feel the gelatin slide down your throat while the dead fish stared back at you. It is basically a savory fish popsicle that tastes like the bottom of a river. It is hard to trust anyone who looks at a bowl of cold, fishy jello and says, yes, this is exactly what I was craving for dinner. 8. Ambergris. Ambergris is a fancy name for an ingredient that is actually just a waxy lump of old whale vomit. Medieval cooks used this gray, rock-like substance that washed up on beaches as a super expensive spice for pies and even scrambled eggs. They loved the musky smell and thought it added a magical flavor to their dishes without realizing it came from the stomach of a giant sea creature. Imagine feeling incredibly fancy because you can afford the most expensive spice in the world only to realize you are sprinkling aged whale belly rejection all over your breakfast. It really proves that if something is rare enough, rich people will eat it no matter how gross it is. 9. Garbage. Garbage was actual food and not just what you throw in the bin after dinner. While we use that word for trash today, medieval cooks used it as the name for a soup made from the leftover bits of chickens like heads, feet, and livers. They would boil these throwaway parts with herbs and serve it up like it was a gourmet meal. It is hilarious to think about a fancy lord sitting at a banquet table and politely asking his servant for another warm bowl of garbage. It shows that back then, wasting nothing was so important that they literally turned the scrap bucket into a menu item and convinced everyone it was delicious. 10. Porpoise porridge. Porpoise porridge sounds like a bad prank, but it was a genuine dish served at royal tables. Cooks would take the heavy oily meat and fat from a porpoise and boil it together with oatmeal to make a thick black sludge. It was described as being incredibly salty and having a smell that could clear a room, yet they served it as a delicacy. Most of us enjoy a nice bowl of oatmeal with fruit or honey, but medieval folks apparently preferred their morning oats to taste like a greasy harbor. It is hard to understand how anyone could swallow a spoonful of fishy black mush and think they were having a great time. 11. Rotten meddlers. You know how you normally throw away fruit when it turns brown and mushy because it is disgusting? Well, medieval people looked at rotten fruit and said, "Yummy, give me a spoon." The meddler is a fruit that is rock hard and inedible when fresh, so you literally have to leave it in sawdust until it starts to decay and turn into brown slime. They politely called this process bledding, but let us be real here, they were eating compost. It tastes like applesauce mixed with dirt and looks absolutely terrible. It is hilarious to think that nobility would sit there scooping brown goo out of a rotten skin and pretending it was a fancy dessert instead of something you would find at the bottom of a garbage bin. 12. The perpetual stew. This was the lazy cooking hack that literally never ended, and it is essentially a biological gamble in a pot. Peasant families would keep a cauldron of brown soup simmering over the fire 24 hours a day for weeks or even months at a time without ever emptying it. They would just throw in whatever random cabbage or mystery meat they found that day to top it off. You could technically be eating a piece of carrot that was thrown in there 3 weeks ago by your grandmother. It is basically a soup museum that slowly ferments in your kitchen, and you just have to pray that the heat kills whatever new life forms are growing in the bottom of the pot. 13. Salted whale tongue. Nothing says I have too much money quite like eating a pickled tongue the size of a sofa. Since whales were considered royal fish, the best cuts went to the king, and for some reason the king wanted to French kiss a sea monster. They would salt these giant tongues to preserve them, which turned the meat into something with the texture of a car tire. You would be sitting there at a banquet gnawing on a slab of rubbery muscle that tasted like pure salt and ocean funk. It is the kind of meal that takes 3 hours to chew, which I guess is one way to make sure you do not eat too fast, but it sounds like a jaw workout from hell. 14. Cockscombs. If you have ever looked at a rooster and thought, "Wow, that floppy red thing on its head looks delicious," then you belong in the 14th century. Chefs would slice off the combs, which are those rubbery red mohawks, and boil them until they were tender to use as a garnish. You are essentially eating the bird's forehead decoration, which has the mouthfeel of a warm gummy bear made of meat. It serves absolutely no nutritional purpose and has a weird, wobbly texture, so eating it is basically like chewing on a savory rubber band just because you can. 15. Tripe. Imagine chewing on a rubber bath mat that smells like a farm, and you have a pretty good idea of what this delicacy tastes like. Tripe is literally the lining of a cow's stomach, which has a texture somewhere between an old tire and a sponge. Medieval people boiled it for hours and smothered it in onions. But there is no hiding the fact that you are eating an organ designed to digest grass. It is rubbery, squishy, and requires so much jaw strength to chew that you basically get a full-face workout just trying to finish your dinner. 16. Humble pie. You have definitely heard the phrase, eating humble pie when someone gets embarrassed, but back then it was an actual lunch menu item. The word comes from numbles, which was the polite medieval name for the heart liver and other random innards of a deer. While the rich guys ate the steaks, the servants chopped up the organ meat, seasoned it heavily to hide the smell, and baked it into a crust. It is essentially the original mystery meat hot pocket, where you just close your eyes and hope you are not chewing on a lung. 17. Gruel. This culinary masterpiece was basically just wet sadness served in a wooden bowl. Gruel is often confused with porridge, but it is much thinner, sloppier, and more depressing, consisting of just some oats boiled in mostly water until it turns into gray slime. It was the staple food for peasants who could not afford real flavors, so they just slurped down this beige wallpaper paste to stay alive. It had the consistency of mucus and the flavor of absolutely nothing, which makes you wonder why they didn't just eat the wooden bowl instead. 18. Caudle. Mixing wine and milk sounds like a recipe for a stomachache, but medieval doctors actually thought it was a health drink. Caudle was a thick, warm beverage made by curdling milk with ale or wine and adding spices and egg yolks until it looked like lumpy soup. It was supposed to be comforting for sick people, which is ironic because looking at a cup of chunky alcohol would probably make a healthy person feel ill. It is like drinking a boozy pancake batter that has gone bad and pretending it is medicine. 19. Horse bread. The name of this food is not a joke or a metaphor because it was literally bread made for horses that poor people had to eat. It was baked from a rough mixture of dried peas beans and the leftover chaff from wheat that was usually thrown in the stable. The texture was incredibly dense and gritty, like chewing on a brick made of birdseed. It is wild to think there was a time when you could look at your horse's dinner bucket and say, "Hey, that looks pretty good, can I have a slice?" 20. Stockfish. This was not just food, it was practically a construction material. Stockfish is cod that has been air-dried in the cold wind until it becomes hard enough to use as a baseball bat. To actually eat this fish plank, you had to beat it with a hammer for an hour and then soak it in lye, which is a chemical used to make soap. So you are essentially eating a rehydrated fish mummy that tastes like soap and chewy leather. It is amazing that people went to so much effort to eat a fish that clearly wanted to stay a fossil. 21. Verjuice. Medieval people apparently hated sweet things because they drowned absolutely everything in this sour liquid. Verjuice is the juice made from pressing unripe grapes that are too green and bitter to be wine. It is incredibly acidic and tastes like sucking on a lemon while drinking vinegar. Yet they poured it over meat, fish, and even vegetables like it was ketchup. It is wild to think their taste buds were so broken that they thought the best way to improve a meal was to make it taste like pure heartburn in a bottle. 22. Sops. Before spoons were common, people ate sops, which is just a fancy way of saying soggy bread floating in liquid. They would take a slice of stale bread and drown it in wine soup or sauce until it turned into a mushy, disintegrating sponge. It is basically baby food for adults who gave up on chewing. The texture must have been like eating a wet woolen sock, but back then, soaking your carb brick in broth was considered a complete and hearty dinner. It is hard to feel dignified when you are fishing slimy bread chunks out of a bowl with your fingers. 23. Sheep trotters. While we usually throw animal feet in the trash, medieval foodies thought gnawing on hooves was a great time. Trotters are sheep feet boiled until the skin and tendons turn into a gelatinous goo that slides right off the bone. There is very little meat involved, so you are mostly just sucking on sticky fat and cartilage while holding the animal's foot like a handshake. It is one of those meals that makes you wonder if the chef was playing a prank, because sitting there sucking on a boiled toe is not exactly my idea of a delicious Friday night. 24. Toast water. This recipe is so incredibly sad that it barely qualifies as food. When someone was feeling sick or weak, doctors would recommend toasting a piece of bread until it was burnt black and then soaking it in a jug of water for an hour. The result was brown, murky water with floating charcoal bits that tasted like a house fire. They honestly believed this was a nutritious energy drink, which really explains why everyone was always sick. It is the culinary equivalent of drinking the water from your dish sponge and pretending it is medicine. 25. Peas pudding. You might know the old nursery rhyme about peas porridge cold, but the reality was a dense block of green regret. This was dried peas boiled down until they turned into a thick, solid brick that you could literally slice with a knife like cake. Peasants would eat the same batch of cold leftovers for days, and it would just get harder and grayer as the week went on. It is basically hummus that gave up on life. Eating a cold slice of 9-day-old pea cement sounds like a punishment rather than a meal, but for them it was just a standard lunch. 26. Head cheese. Despite the name, there is absolutely zero cheese involved in this nightmare, which makes it an even bigger betrayal. This dish is made by boiling the head of a pig or cow until the meat falls off, and then letting the natural collagen turn the broth into a solid jelly loaf containing the meat chunks. It looks like a meat mosaic suspended in cold slime. You slice it and put it on bread so you can see exactly which part of the face you're about to eat. It is the kind of food that wobbles when you touch it, which is something meat should never ever do. 27. Cod sounds. The name makes it sound like you are listening to a fish make noise, but it is actually much worse because you are eating its internal organs. Sounds are the swim bladders of the codfish, which are these rubbery air-filled balloons that help them float. Medieval cooks would harvest these gas bags and boil them until they turned into a sticky glue-like substance. It is literally the part of the fish that is used to make isinglass glue for furniture, but people back then were chewing on it like it was bubblegum. You are basically eating a fish balloon that tastes like sticky seawater, which is just a baffling snack choice. 28. Salmagundi. This dish is what happens when a chef trips while carrying all the groceries and just decides to serve whatever landed on the floor. It was a chaotic salad that combined literally everything, including cooked meats, seafood, vegetables, fruit nuts, and flowers, all drowning in oil and vinegar. You could have a bite of roast chicken mixed with a pickled herring and a grape at the same time. It is a flavor confusion that defies all logic, like a buffet exploded on your plate. They thought it was a masterpiece of variety, but to modern taste buds, it looks like the garbage disposal backed up. 29. Sweat pudding. If you love the taste of hard kidney fat, then you would have been in heaven because this dessert is practically made of it. Sweat is the raw, hard fat found around the kidneys of a cow, and medieval bakers used it to make dense, heavy puddings that sat in your stomach like a cannonball. They would mix this chopped fat with flour and dried fruit and boil it in a cloth for hours. You are essentially eating a cake made of beef grease and raisins. It is the kind of dessert that requires a nap immediately after eating because your body has to work overtime just to process that much animal lard. 30. Puffins. We think of puffins as adorable birds that belong on a calendar, but medieval people looked at them and saw a fish substitute. Because these birds swim in the sea, the church classified them as fish, which meant you could eat them during religious fasts. The problem is that puffin meat is incredibly oily and tastes strongly of fishy sludge. Imagine eating a cute bird that tastes like a rancid anchovy. It is another hilarious example of people twisting the rules to get a meat dinner only to end up eating something that tastes worse than the vegetables they were trying to avoid. 31. Frumenty. This was the ultimate comfort food if your idea of comfort is thick wheat glue served with meat. Frumenty was made by boiling cracked wheat in milk or broth until it burst into a gelatinous slime and then pouring it over venison or pork. It is basically savory oatmeal, but way slimier and served as a side dish for dinner. The texture is somewhere between wallpaper paste and frog eggs. It is hard to imagine a king sitting down to a feast and excitedly asking someone to pass the bowl of gray wheat sludge to pour over his nice steak. 32. Hippocras. In an era when water could kill you, everyone drank wine, but sometimes the wine tasted so bad they had to improvise. Hippocras was cheap bad wine that was heavily sweetened with sugar and spices to hide the vinegar taste, and then strained through a cloth filter called a Hippocratic sleeve. The funny part is that this filter often looks suspiciously like an old sock. So you are drinking spicy syrup wine that has been filtered through a rag to remove the chunks. It was considered a high-class medicinal drink, but it sounds like the kind of desperate cocktail you make when you have run out of everything else. 33. Acorn bread. When the wheat harvest failed, peasants had to get creative, and by creative I mean they started eating squirrel food. They would gather acorns from the forest floor, grind them into a powder, and try to bake bread with it. The problem is that acorns are incredibly bitter and full of tannins that dry out your mouth instantly, so you are eating a dense bitter brick that tastes like wood and disappointment. It is the ultimate desperation dinner that reminds you that being a peasant in the Middle Ages was basically just a full-time job of trying to digest things that are not supposed to be food. 34. Chitterlings. If you have a weak stomach, you should probably stop listening because this one is a challenge. Chitterlings are the small intestines of a pig that have been boiled and fried. While people still eat them today in the Middle Ages, the cleaning process was, let us say, a lot less thorough. You were rolling the dice on whether your dinner was going to taste like pork or like the actual contents of a pig's digestive tract. The smell of them cooking has been described as barnyard funk, which is a polite way of saying it smells like a toilet. It takes a very brave, hungry person to eat a tube that was literally designed to carry waste. 35. Sugar on fish. Medieval rich people were like toddlers who just discovered sugar for the first time and decided to put it on absolutely everything. They did not care if flavors matched, so they would cover salty fish like cod or pike with a mountain of sugar and cinnamon. Imagine eating a fish stick that has been dipped in donut glaze and rolled in candy. It is a flavor combination that makes zero sense and sounds like something a stoned college student would invent at 3 in the morning. Yet kings ate this and thought they were culinary geniuses. 36. Heron. Today we look at a heron and see a graceful bird standing in a lake, but medieval people saw a flying snack. The problem is that herons live in swamps and eat fish, so their meat tastes like a mixture of old mud and rotten seafood. It is greasy, tough, and smells like a wet dog that rolled in seaweed. Cooks had to use heavy spices just to hide the fact that you were eating a swamp creature. It is hilarious that they went to so much trouble to catch a bird that tastes like the bottom of a dirty pond. 37. Lard on bread. We all love butter, but medieval peasants often could not afford it, so they used the next best thing, which was just straight pig fat. They would spread a thick layer of cold white lard onto their bread and eat it as a meal. You are literally biting into a solid chunk of animal grease that coats your entire mouth in an oily film. It is like eating a savory candle. It gives a whole new meaning to the phrase heart attack on a plate, because your arteries would probably clog up just by looking at this greasy snack. 38. Hardtack. This was the bread that fought back. Sailors and soldiers ate these rock-hard biscuits that were baked 4 times to remove every single drop of moisture so they wouldn't rot. The result was a brick of flour that was so hard it could literally break your teeth if you tried to bite it dry. You had to soak it in beer or water just to turn it into a chewable mush. It is essentially edible concrete. It is hard to enjoy your lunch when you need a hammer and chisel just to take a bite of your sandwich. 39. Whelks. If you enjoy the texture of snot, then you would love medieval seafood because whelks were on the menu. These are giant sea snails that live in shells and look like slimy boogers when you pull them out. Poor people gathered them by the bucket because they were free, but eating them is a challenge. They are rubbery, chewy, and taste like salty rubber bands dipped in slime. It takes a lot of hunger to look at a snail crawling on a rock and think, yes, that looks like a delicious treat I should put in my mouth immediately. 40. Pike. This river fish was famous not for its taste, but for being the most annoying meal on the planet. Pike meat is filled with thousands of tiny sharp bones that are almost impossible to remove completely. Eating it was a dangerous game where every bite could end with you choking on a needle. The meat itself tastes like mud because the fish hangs out in the dirtiest parts of the river. So you are risking your life to eat a fish that tastes like dirt. It seems like a lot of risk for a very disappointing reward. 41. Ale for breakfast. This is not a food, but it explains why people ate all this weird stuff. In the Middle Ages, the water was often dangerous to drink, so everyone, including kids, drank weak ale starting first thing in the morning. Imagine waking up at sunrise and immediately chugging a beer with your oatmeal. By noon, the entire village was probably slightly buzzed, which explains why they thought eating beaver tails and swamp birds was a good idea. It is the only explanation for their menu choices because you would have to be drunk to think any of this food was delicious. 42. Trenchers. We use ceramic plates today because they hold liquid and are easy to clean, but medieval people preferred to eat off a piece of stale bread. A trencher was a thick slab of old hard bread that served as your plate for the entire meal. By the time you finished your meat, the bread plate was a soggy sponge soaked in gravy grease and knife scratches. You essentially had to eat your dinner off a dirty giant crouton that was slowly disintegrating onto the table. It is the only time in history where doing the dishes meant feeding your plate to the dog, because it was too gross to keep. 43. Boiled salad. If you offered a medieval person a fresh, crisp salad, they would probably scream and run away because they thought raw vegetables were poisonous. Doctors believed that eating raw herbs or veggies would give you a fever, so cooks boiled absolutely everything until it was gray mush. Imagine taking a nice crunchy cucumber or some lettuce and boiling it for an hour until it turned into hot green slime. They took healthy vitamins and cooked them into oblivion because they were genuinely terrified of a crunch. It is hilarious that they were scared of a salad but happily ate mysterious river eels. 44. Mustard. This condiment was the real MVP of the Middle Ages, not because it tasted amazing, but because it was the ultimate cover-up. Since they did not have refrigerators, meat would often go bad or taste a bit funky, so they smothered absolutely everything in spicy hot mustard. It was basically used to burn your tongue so severely that you couldn't taste the fact that your roast beef was starting to turn green. They were not using it for flavor, they were using it as edible pepper spray to distract their taste buds from the reality of their dinner. It is the culinary equivalent of turning the radio up loud to hide the noise of your car engine falling apart. You just watched people drink meat, eat rotten fruit on purpose, boil things that should have never been food, and call it fine dining. So here's the real question. If you were dropped into the Middle Ages tomorrow, which one of these foods would you eat to survive, and which one would instantly make you quit and starve instead? No dodging it. Pick one. And if you say none, you're lying. Hunger always wins. Drop your answer in the comments because I want to see who actually has the strongest stomach. And if your brain hurts right now, hit like, subscribe, and stay here, because history only gets worse from this point.